And Cole, if you could start recording.
Done.
And I'd like to welcome everyone to this meeting tonight to discuss some really important topics. My name is Paul Shannon. I'm with the Massachusetts Peace and Climate Working Group, and I'm here tonight with Brian and Cole from Mass Peace Action. Brian and Cole will be running the technology. So if anything goes wrong, you can blame them. But I think this will be fine. We kind of like this meeting format rather than the webinar format. So let's see how it works out. Tonight, of course, we have as our speaker, Craig Altemose. Craig is one of those people in our area that's right in the thick of all the climate action going on and has been for quite a while now. And he's also one of the leaders in our climate movement who's considering the implications of both the COVID pandemic and the amazing racial justice uprising. The implications for those two things for the climate movement. So it'll be interesting to see what Craig has to say tonight. Just quickly, Craig, he's the founding executive director of the Better Future Project. Now, I just want to explain how Better Future relates to some of these other projects that you're familiar with. But first, I'll just say that the Better Future Project organizes communities, campuses, and coalitions to address the climate crisis through its programs. And what are those programs? These are the ones you've probably heard of mostly. There's 350 Mass, there's Divest Ed, and there's Communities Responding to Extreme Weather, otherwise known as CREW. So those three projects are under the umbrella of Better Future. Before starting the Better Future Project, Craig co-founded and led Students for a Just and Stable Future. This is a statewide student network that engaged students at more than 15 Massachusetts universities on climate policy. Craig holds a bachelor's degree in international relations from Eckerd College. He has a Master of Public Policy from the John F. Kennedy School of Government and a JD from Harvard Law School. So he's covering a lot of bases here. And we're very pleased to have you with us here tonight, Craig. Let's get right into this.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Paul and Cole and Brian and everyone at Mass Peace Action for having me today. I actually got my teeth really first as a peace activist. My freshman year of college was when Bush made the idiotic, illegal, and immoral decision to invade Iraq. And I tried very hard to stop that before it happened, but obviously we did not manage to win on that one. But so peace has always been an issue near and dear to my heart, and it's great to be with so many like-minded warriors for justice. Although warriors the wrong term for that. But anyway, so I actually have a slide deck here, which we'll jump right into. And thank you again, Paul, for that kind introduction. So again, here to talk some of my reflections on key lessons for the climate movement from the COVID-19 pandemic, which are that science is real and that racism is real, and that we need to really aggressively listen to both of those things as we do our work. So I think everyone here, probably agrees pretty well how both science and racism are real. Some threw in a couple of music comics on my end, but unfortunately, we have a pretty big problem in society of really dismissing science in particular as the first one. And so I did pull up a number of quotes from our dear, lovely president here about COVID-19. So we have it totally under control. It's one person coming from China, January 22nd. We think it's going to have a very good ending for it, so that I can assure you. January 30th, looks like by April, in theory, when it gets a little warmer, it miraculously goes away. In our country, we only have basically 12 cases, and most of these are people recovering, and there are some cases fully recovered, so it's actually less. In a couple of days, the number of cases is going to be down close to zero. That's pretty good job we've done. If we have hundreds or thousands of people that just get better by, sitting around, even going to work, some of them go to work, they get better, it's not that severe. And finally, so last year, 37,000 Americans died from the common flu. It averages between 27,000 and 70,000 per year. Nothing is shut down. Life and the economy go on. At this moment, there are 546 confirmed cases of coronavirus with 22 deaths. Think about that on March 9th. And we all know how that dismissing of the science turned out for us very tragically here on this issue. But I do just want to name that as much as the climate community has really tried to have a science-based approach, I think we've honestly have actually failed to do that as much as we really should. And a case in point here is the Global Warming Solutions Act, which I was proud to advocate for. Spent a lot of time while I was in graduate school here advocating for this bill. As a state senator, Pamela Resser, who was one of the key committee chairs at this time, said when the bill was passed, it was, that sets realistic long-term goals for carbon reduction through 2050. But it was really based on a goal of keeping CO2 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at 450 parts per million and keeping temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius. And unfortunately, even back then, that goal was not necessarily fully agreed upon by the scientists. There's a very, to me, really big letter that the Woods Hole Center over here on the Cape in Massachusetts led on that said, in many political circles around the world, the view has taken hold that nations should endeavor both to limit the buildup of carbon dioxide, the principal greenhouse gas and a byproduct of burning coal, oil, and natural gas, to 450 parts per million, and to limit the rise of global temperatures to less than 2 degrees Celsius. We and many others are of the view that these objectives are inadequate to sustain the integrity of global climate and to hold the risk of ruinous climatic change to an acceptably low level. And this is again signed by 20 very, very prominent climate scientists, including Michael Mann, who's perhaps most well known from that list. But again, even back in 2009, the notion that the 2 degrees Celsius goal was the right goal, again, was not agreed upon widely by scientists, even though in many political circles that had become the bar that we had set. And thankfully, that bar, and just for fun, here's what our governor was saying back in that time. I'm not saying I believe in it, I'm not saying I don't. You're asking me to take a position on something I don't know enough about. That was Governor Baker's position on climate change back in 2010, just for historical context. So yes, thankfully, we have evolved to look at the 1.5 degrees Celsius. There's a very big report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2008 that came out really saying that actually 1.5 degrees should be the upper threshold for temperature change and that there are a lot of really horrific consequences if we exceed that goal. And unfortunately, they didn't say everything as clearly as they could have. This is, I think, the sentence that was the most clear about what our goal should be. And I'm not going to read through that whole thing for you. It's there on the screen. But the short version is that if we wanted to have a 50% chance of avoiding 1.5 degrees Celsius, we needed to get to carbon neutrality by 2050. That should be the global goal. If we want to have a more than 50% chance, and the only other pathway they laid out was for a 2/3 chance of avoiding that, then we need to do that by 2040 and to have the entire world go carbon neutral by 2040. And here was what I thought was a really powerful quote from Greta Thunberg, who I think a lot of you have heard of as the girl leading the global climate strikes movement, that 50% may be acceptable to you, but those numbers do not include tipping points, most feedback loops, additional warming hidden by toxic air pollution, or the aspects of equity and climate justice. They also rely on my generation sucking hundreds of billions of tons of your CO2 out of the air with technologies that barely exist. So a 50% risk is simply not acceptable to us, we who have to live with the consequences. And again, that's Greta Thunberg. in 2019, really throwing a lot of shade on the notion that a carbon neutral by 2050 goal is sufficient, and that a 50% chance, which again, everything she says there is backed up by the science, and happy to go into that in the Q&A. But it's not even an authentic 50% chance. It's actually less than a 50% chance when you factor in things like tipping points, feedback loops, and so on. And then here is our governor on Earth Day. On the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, we are proud to continue Massachusetts' national leadership on climate change by formally committing the Commonwealth to an ambitious net zero emissions limit by 2050. And again, that is the ambitious limit that gives us at best a 50% chance of avoiding what scientists say we should really avoid at all costs. And again, it's inconvenient to say these things. It's inconvenient to share these numbers. But we've seen very clearly with COVID that inconvenient or not, science is real and the impacts are real. And it's not sufficient for us to just really wish away our problems. We have to deal with them head on. So again, to put this in another way, would you rather board a plane with a 50% chance of getting COVID-19, or would you rather board a plane with a 33% chance of getting COVID-19? And unfortunately, in the climate realm, we are already committed to boarding the plane. That decision has been made. We are getting on an airplane. But we still have a chance for now to choose which plane we board, with a 33% chance or the 50% chance of disaster. And obviously, there are many other planes that we can board beyond these that get a lot worse. But personally, if I have to choose between those, I would much rather board the plane with only a 33% chance of disaster than a plane with a coin flip chance of disaster. So again, just want to reemphasize these numbers. If we get zero global pollution by 2040, that means we have a 2/3 chance of avoiding 1.5 degrees Celsius. If we wait until 2050, those odds go down to 50%. And I think a really key thing for those of us here in Massachusetts to remember is that if we want Massachusetts to lead, we should do more than what we're requiring of the entire world, right? Like that, by definition, leadership means going out front, going first, doing more. I think if we just commit ourselves to what the whole world should be doing, I would suggest that's not necessarily really leadership. Obviously, it's better than what folks in Wyoming and West Virginia are doing. But at the end of the day, we don't get, Mother Nature doesn't grade on a curve. They don't say, well, you did better than other folks, so we're not going to have the same consequences for you. We are all in this together. And again, Massachusetts as a state and the United States as a country are much better resourced than places like Brazil or South Africa or Nigeria to really deal with climate change and investing in the technologies and achieving them on scale to get off of fossil fuels. So that's my key reflection for the first lesson. To move on to our second one here, that racism is also real. And again, I think, I think how racist our country is, how racist our systems and structures have become a lot more clear to folks in the Trump era. But just want to remind everyone through this cartoon that obviously racism is systemic, it is pervasive, and it is long lasting, and its roots go so much deeper than our current ruling regime, unfortunately. I think for me, one of the real key lessons was that our state put out, the Mass Public Health Department put out the crisis standards of care early on in the pandemic when it looked like we were going to be facing a shortage of ICU units. It's intensive care units, sorry. What they put out was, doctors and nurses should not consider any of a long list of factors, including race, disability, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, ethnicity, ability to pay, immigration status, or incarceration, which I think to a lot of us in the progressive community, saying that we shouldn't factor in these variables made sense, right? Like it seemed like a good thing. Like, yeah, you shouldn't discriminate against someone because of their race when we're deciding who should get, a limited ventilator. Basically, right? And then it went on, when creating a score for critically ill adult patients, the hospital team will consider the state of a patient's organs and whether they have a chronic illness or condition. Pregnant patients and first responders will be given a priority score. In the event of a tie, the youngest patient will likely get to the ICU bed or ventilator. So here they're saying really the only people who should be privileged are first responders, pregnant women, and then if there's a tie, you go to the younger patient who has, in theory, a longer life ahead of them, right? And otherwise, the state of their organs and chronic illness and conditions, that's really independent of all these other variables. I think it was the spirit of this. And I don't mean to call out Dr. Foro, who I'm sure is a very good person, but the guidelines just released are as thoughtful as any that any state has yet produced, because they've built from so much important work that other states have done before us. Now, unfortunately, as thoughtful as these guidelines were, they did not have a systemic racial analysis to them. And that, to me, is, again, I think, a really key lesson that COVID shows us, which is that when you have a racist society and racist systems and racist structures, and you add on top of that a race-neutral policy, you should not be surprised when you take a transparent thing over a red thing that you get racist outcomes, right? Just because your policy is race neutral, if you are applying that to a society that is inherently structurally racist, you should expect to get racist outcomes. And to highlight that connection here it's not enough not to be racist as we do policies, and again, particularly for climate change. If we want race-neutral outcomes, much less equitable outcomes, we must be anti-racist, explicitly and intentionally anti-racist in how we design these policies. And there's a study back in 2000 that really highlighted environmental racism and its connections to human health here. It found that in predominantly white communities in Massachusetts, that there were about 2 hazardous waste sites per square mile and about 19,000 pounds of chemical pollution released annually. Now, does anyone want to guess what they found in communities of color, the majority of communities of color in Massachusetts? How many? If people want to put some guesses into the chat box, anyone want to be brave, how many hazardous waste sites per square mile there were? I'm going to wait a moment for a guess or two to, let's see. We've got 57, anyone else? 10, 48. So Gabrielle was the closest, very close, Gabrielle. 48 hazardous waste sites per square mile and 200,000 pounds of chemical pollution released annually. So if we go back, and I should say, actually, so this is again 2000, which is a little bit dated, but this was really shocking news at the time. And the governor immediately convened a task force that we need to address this. And they looked at the data again in 2005, and it had gotten worse. The data only got worse. And I was reading an article by Professor Faber back in 2015 where they hadn't studied it again, but he had no reason to expect that things had changed in the intervening decade. And so if we, if I can go back here, I guess I can go back. But if we think back to the last slide again, where we say, well, if your organs are in worse shape or you've got pre-existing conditions, you are penalized. And you look at how Massachusetts communities, who gets the brunt of these environmental pollution, we shouldn't be surprised if
Uh-oh, Craig is froze up.
Craig, can you hear us?
Let's give him a minute.
Thanks for bearing with us, everyone, and understanding. There are technical issues involved with doing this all virtually, but I'm sure Craig will rejoin us shortly.
We can all memorize these figures.
How about we all turn off our video? Sometimes turning off the video helps.
Couldn't hurt.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion.
I have a feeling it's to Craig's end, though, to be honest. But
Hello, all. Sorry about that.
Hey,
There he is.
Um,
so
my-
we left off with the 200,000 pounds, or tons,
Great.
I guess. It's,
yeah, thank you. Sorry about that. I kept talking after you all lost me. My apologies.
That's okay, Craig.
So yeah, so again, 200,000 pounds. So just saying, if you look to the connections with the previous slide, it should be pretty clear that people of color are actually disadvantaged as we look at who is getting priority access to ICU beds, who's getting ventilators. If you are living in a community, your organs are going to be worse. If you have 48 hazardous waste sites per square mile instead of 2, if you have 200,000 pounds, if you have 10 times as much chemical pollution in your community, you shouldn't expect your organs to be just as good as the next person's. And so again, just, theoretical perspective for folks, would you rather live in a community with 2 waste sites per square mile or with 48? Obviously, white people have largely gotten a choice and they've chosen to protect their health. And Black and brown people have historically not really had that choice for economic reasons, for structural racist reasons, and have had others choose for them and have chosen for them 48 hazardous waste sites per square mile. And then to make matters worse, it's not just that they have these pre-existing conditions that make them more vulnerable to dying from COVID. As we've seen in Massachusetts, both Latinx and Black residents are more likely to catch COVID because of the lack of social safety net protections for those communities, because they're more likely to hold low wage earning positions, where they can't take sick days as easily, where they have more likely to be frontline vulnerable workers. They don't have houses in New Hampshire that to retreat to. They don't have savings accounts to fall back on to sacrifice pay if they have to do that to avoid work. And yeah, so again, I think just COVID has made very, very clear that that racism is real. Again, it's structural. It is systemic in our society. And yeah, again, I just feel like it's really important for us to keep in mind that if you take a racist society, add a race-neutral policy, you should expect racist outcomes. So again, as we're thinking about climate policies, we have to really be thoughtful about how are the policies we're designing not doing more harm to these people with metaphorical boots on their necks, but how are we actually helping to lift up those boots and take them off as we do our work. So I want to get us into the Q&A because I think that's really the best part. I do want to share just a couple of personal reflections of where to go and some opportunities on the horizon for folks. First, I think we really need to listen to Black and brown leadership right now. And again, I think that means we've heard pretty clearly defund the police is that movement's call. I think a lot of white folks in particular feel like they know better than Black and brown people about, well, no, we shouldn't defund the police because of X and Y. And again, I think these are the folks whose communities have been suffering. They have unique wisdom about the solutions that we need. And I think we have an obligation to listen to their voices and to follow their leadership. And I think if you dive into the research, there are a lot of things that we can be doing very differently with our police department that is generally wildly overpaid, overcompensated, over-resourced in our communities. But also, again, I think as we're devising climate policies, again, we need to listen to and follow Black and brown leadership to make sure that their voices are centered as we're designing these policies so that we get anti-racist, equitable outcomes. Second, again, we really need to educate ourselves on science. Those numbers I talked about earlier, and I did see in the chat that some folks were lifting up even the 2040 may be too late. We were already passing tipping points. I think that's very, very fair. I would largely agree with all of that and would certainly support more aggressive timelines than 2040 for decarbonization. And we need to educate ourselves on racism and systemic racism, its sources, its implications, its roots, and really interrogate within ourselves how are we bringing our respective biases to the table and how do we correct against them. Third, again, really thinking through a just recovery as we are coming out of COVID. This is a real big inflection point for society. We have such an opportunity here. We saw with the Great Depression that gave us the New Deal. in this country. And I think we have, again, such an opportunity as we leave what I think is going to be called the second Great Depression. How do we come out from this, and what are the values we want to center? What are the policies we want to be advancing? And again, I think we really need to make sure that as we are coming out and recovering from both not just the disease, but the economic fallout from our appropriate precautions around COVID. Again, how are we lifting up Black and Brown voices, Black and Brown needs in this recovery, as well as making it a green recovery? And I think very closely tied to that for me, again, it's the Massachusetts Green New Deal. And we have helped pull together a table that I'm proud to say has centered Black and Brown voices and union voices. We've been meeting behind the scenes for over a year now with some key leaders to try to build trust and build a coalition. And that the plan is in January of 2021 to introduce into the state legislature here a bill or a number of bills that will advance a Massachusetts Green New Deal that includes rapid decarbonization and good paying jobs and racial justice, with these respective communities lifting up their priorities for those. And then also, again, want to make sure that we are supporting candidates for a Green New Deal. So on Tuesday next week, if you guys haven't heard about this, Renew New England is launching, which is an effort to elect 100+ candidates at the state legislative level across New England who will support Green New Deal policies in all 6 New England states. And so our Massachusetts Green New Deal table is very much nested within that. And I can put the link into the chat in a moment, but that launch will include Senator Bernie Sanders, Representative Ayanna Pressley, Representative Ro Khanna, and Varshini Prakash, actually former intern of mine who's now the executive director, much more importantly, the executive director of the Sunrise Movement and a Massachusetts native. And so I think that will provide an opportunity for folks to get involved in supporting Green New Deal candidates locally here in Massachusetts and around New England. And then I do want to also lift up Ed Markey from the United States Senate, which both Mass Peace Action and 350 Mass Action have proudly endorsed as the Senate author of the Green New Deal. If you haven't yet, pledged your support to Ed or volunteered for his campaign, strongly encourage you to do that, because we really need him to get back in there to be the Senate partner to AOC that we need in the Senate. And then I do have a special ask, which Paul had asked me to lift up, which I'm going to share my screen here. So if folks go to maclimatedemocracy.org, if someone, maybe I can slide that in the chat, and I will put the other link in the chat. Thank you, Gabrielle. So 350 Mass is partnering with Act on Mass to put 2 ballot questions in districts around the state this fall. We need 200 signatures per district in order for each question to qualify. The questions are, on climate, should the representative for this district be instructed to vote in favor of legislation that would require Massachusetts to achieve 100% renewable energy use within the next 2 decades, or by 2040 at the latest, in other words, making significant progress in the first 5 years while protecting impacted workers and businesses? And second, shall the representative for this district be instructed to vote in favor of changes to the legislature's rules that would make the results of all votes in legislative committees publicly available on the legislature's website? Now, as a lot of you may know, our legislature is very not transparent and really not accountable then, because if a bill fails in committee, which so many bills do, it's really hard to know who to blame because they don't publish the committee votes. And so we're hoping with these 2 questions, they are non-binding, but that we can put them before voters, and then we can go to legislators come January when the next session starts and say, 93% of the voters in your district told you to vote in favor of transparent committee votes. 89% of the voters in your district told you to vote in favor of 100% renewables by 2040. What excuse do you have? There's a very clear mandate from your voters. And then if they choose not to, again, our 501c4 arms, in theory, the next election have that to hold that against them, and to say, you disregarded the direct, explicit instruction by 93% of your voters. And so, unfortunately, our plans to do a lot of in-person signature collection around this was made much more challenging with COVID-19. We just in this past week got permission from the state to do these, to sign these signatures digitally. So we can now do e-signatures, which is very exciting. And so I would really encourage everyone, when we're done with this call, to sign and get as many of your friends and family to sign. We need to have as many of the signatures in as possible by July 1st, so we have time to print them all and to take them to the 160 different, or up to 160 different, city halls around the state where these are being vetted and collected. And so just to walk people through very quickly how this is done, you select your district, and if you don't know your district, there's a button right here where you can click and you can find your legislator. But let's say your district is 2nd Barnstable, you click on that, and then you need to sign, make sure you sign both of these. You just go down here at the bottom and you do your best to sign your name with your mouse like this. You just sign it and then enter your information, your name, your email address, your legal voting residence, your city, your state. You click submit, and then you do that again for the second question, assuming you're willing to support both the climate question and the democracy question, and that's it. It's that simple. You just sign, you find your district, sign your name, and then enter your name, email, address, and click submit. And so again, we need 200 per district. And so, if you have the ability to help get others from your district to sign, that would be really, really helpful. Again, we've got about a week to do this. So, it's a bit of a race to the finish. But thankfully, again, it's really, really easy to use at this point. So we would really appreciate it if everyone here can sign, and then again, help spread the word to other voters in your district to sign this, so that we can get this on as many ballots, as many district ballots as possible come November. So with that, I'm gonna jump back to my slide to go to the questions in the Q&A, and we'll end the screen share. So Paul or Cole or Brian, I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you, Craig. Yeah, let's to raise to ask a question. If you go to participants and click on that, you will see at the bottom of that window a raise hand symbol. So if you want to ask a question, please click that. It'll go next to your name, and we'll ask Cole or Brian to unmute you so you can ask the question. Would ask you also to unmute your camera so that we can see you. So the first question I see out there is from John McDougall. Brian, can you unmute John?
I think I'm unmuted. Can everybody hear me?
Sure did. Go ahead, John.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks a lot, Cole. Craig, this was great. Very, very helpful. Question, my impression is that another kind of action that we should be ready for is there's a reason, and Craig, you may know more details, there's a reasonable chance there will be some additional federal stimulus money coming down the pike, some of which will go to issues that are more long-term and not just be so-called shovel-ready, which was a real catastrophe in many ways in the Obama stimulus. So if you have, Craig, any thoughts about, I know there's some work going on because I've been part of those discussions, to make sure that when federal money does become available, that it really goes to the right kind of climate projects. If you want to comment on that, Craig, that would be helpful.
Yeah, great question, John. I think you could probably speak as intelligently about it as I can, but absolutely. Again, this is a real opportunity here that, we've already seen literally trillions of dollars, as everyone knows, poured into the economy. And as John names, there are good ways to spend that money and there are bad ways to spend that money. Bailing out the airline industry would definitely qualify as a bad way to spend that money. Bailing out the oil industry would be another very bad way to spend that money. But investing in the long-term health and sustainability of our communities, and again, to have a just decarbonization plan is absolutely the right way to spend that money. And so as John alluded to, there's a team within 350 Mass that's been working on coming up with a really sophisticated write-up that we can send and share with our federal legislators. So I would really encourage folks to reach out to your federal legislators and to, as much as possible, shift this in the direction that we can, have as many of those good outcomes as possible. I think with a Republican Senate, we're unlikely to have a really great recovery bill, this session. Obviously, what happens in November may very well change what the future recoveries can look like, but I think our thinking is that we want, as much as possible, shape things so that we at least have the flexibility here in Massachusetts to apply those funds in really constructive, positive ways. And so encouraging our federal legislators to at least make sure there's maximum flexibility in, again, not being tied to, say, having to bail out our local gas industry with subsidies, and instead be able to, again, invest the right way.
Thank you, Craig. The next question is from Anna Henchman.
Okay, hi, let me unmute. Sorry.
Good.
Hi. Thank you so much. That was fascinating and really, really helpful. I have two questions. One is really quick. I signed the papers last night, but is there a way to figure out which, if we know people across Massachusetts, is there a way to figure out which districts need signatures, and how that's going, or is it just kind of as many as possible? Or are there places that it'll be hard to get those signatures?
That's a really great question. I think to be totally transparent, we were not really anticipating this as a mechanism, so I think we're still very much learning.
Okay.
But I would say, if you feel like you have the time and energy to help collect from priority districts, which is a very generous and awesome offering, I would say if you can email ballotquestion@betterfutureproject.org, they should be able to tell you where there are priority districts where we need that tilt. So yeah, if you could email them directly, I think that they would be thrilled to hear of that offering and be happy to utilize whatever time folks have.
Okay, great.
Thank you for signing it, Anna.
Another quick question was, or just thing to point out, was that for those who have for those who saw Heated, Catherine Clark is part of the one of the committees that is determining the platform for the Democrats. And so just calling attention to letting people who have Catherine Clark as their congressperson, letting them know that could be really useful.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Anna. Linda Klein.
It's actually my husband who wants to ask the question, Bernie Horn. So
I just
Okay, Bernie.
wanted to, do we email ballotquestion@betterfuture.org to get the information about signing those things?
So if you go to maclimatedemocracy.org, you can just sign
Go
without
slower.
having.
go slower.
Say that slower.
Yes,
He's not
my apologies. So if you go to the link that's in the chat, maclimatedemocracy.org, that will take you to the website where you can sign them right there.
Great, thank you.
If you want to get paper ballots for your community to collect paper signatures from folks, then you can email that email address to get paper ballots to sign, to get your neighbors to sign, for instance. Or if like, I think it was Anna who wanted to help, with priority districts, they can give you information around where we need particular assistance.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Richard Rabin.
Yes, in the area of workplace health and safety, particularly those that are connected with climate change, I'm wondering what explicit policies you would favor that would be anti-racist, that would favor immigrants and favor minority communities.
In terms of workplace policies.
The workplace policies that would explicitly help those communities.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't claim to have perfect wisdom on that by any stretch, and I'm sure there are other folks here who probably could answer that better than I. I will say, I think one of the things that we are actively investigating within Better Future Project, as we are looking at our hiring and compensation for employees, is, should we actually have, rather than equal salaries for experience, equitable salaries for experience, or are there ways that we can, I think we've created salary bands within our organization really in an effort to check the subconscious bias that has historically led to primarily white men being paid more than women and people of color, and to say, like, if you have X years of experience, regardless of your race or gender, you get paid Y. And I think one of the challenges that we are realizing is that doesn't account for intergenerational wealth. And that, I think like the average white person in Massachusetts has something like $200,000 to their name, whereas the average Black person has about $8 to their name. And that's because of systemic, pervasive, institutionalized racism over many generations. And so for us to say, we just want to pay everyone equally at this moment, that doesn't account for the fact that we're not all starting at the same place, and that the urgency for Black people to build up their savings is much greater generally than the urgency for white people who perhaps can fall, even if they're young, right out of college, can call upon their parents for help if they're afraid about missing their next month's rent. So that's a particular policy we're looking at. Obviously, again, I think like looking at hiring, and I think one of the best practices I've heard is that not to move forward with not to move forward with interviews until you at least have a certain threshold of non-white candidates in your applicant pool. And if you don't have that certain threshold, then you can't move forward. You need to, it's not that you automatically will hire, that you will never hire white people, but that you won't make a hiring decision until you have, again, met a certain threshold of diversity for your application pool. And yeah, I think, again, then in terms of making workplaces feel safe safe and comfortable for Black and Brown and Indigenous and Latinx folks, I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of having your workplace host conversations around race and ethnicity, and creating, I'm blanking on the term, but race-specific support groups. So to have a Black and Brown, a BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color caucus where those folks can meet and talk about their experiences. Then also have a white caucus where white allies can meet and talk about how they can be better allies, and really not put it on the people of color in our workplaces to educate the white folks and to say that it's their job to fix racism, because it's not a problem that they created. It was a problem created by white people, and it's really up to us to really address it and fix it. So I think that those are a couple of resources or ideas I would put forward. But again, I think there's just a huge amount of education of the white community that we need to do. There's a huge amount of assumption checking and reflection and interrogation that we need to have.
Craig, just move that question into the Green New Deal itself. What provisions, especially with what's going on right now, is the new Green New Deal being reshaped to take into consideration these issues of racial inequality?
Yeah, so I mean, again, it very intentionally centered racial justice as part of the Green New Deal at the start. I can't speak to how the federal dialogue is playing around the Green New Deal. I will say that within Massachusetts, our table here really actually kind of hit the pause on diving into the specific details of what we want to file the bill for in January to focus on a more just COVID response. And so that there is a COVID-19 response coalition of sorts that has sprung up. I forget the exact term for it. Maybe the coronavirus response coalition. That a lot of the key members of the Green New Deal table shifted into to support a more just recovery. Again, I think like expanding sick time is certainly one of the top priorities. For folks, I think happily Massachusetts, I believe, is maybe the first state that requires mandatory sick time for all employees, but I think it's only about 5 sick days per person is what's legally required. And obviously, as we have heard, you're supposed to self-isolate for 2 weeks if you catch COVID, or even if you're suspected of catching COVID. And if you only have 5 days of sick time, that's a really tough thing for people to do. So I think certainly expanding the sick time allowance is a top priority. But again, I think that there are a number of other things that, as we look to the Green New Deal, again, better protections for workers. Again, but I think we want our union partners and our environmental justice communities to really be themselves telling us what these solutions are. And so I'm a little bit reluctant to editorialize on what I think they should be, but I think, you know, we've really structured this to make sure that those voices are centered and will be determining the policies that we have coming out of it.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Richard Rabin. Oh, we already had Richard, I think, right?
You already had me.
Sorry, Richard. Timothy, Tim Havel.
Okay, thank you very much. I would just like to point out that we don't necessarily need to wait on the feds to give us money. For example, just to give one example, California back in 2008 started creating IOUs because it couldn't pay all its bills. Those IOUs became effectively a form of currency and were being used to settle transactions. That was terminated once the Fed stepped in. But in fact, there are other mechanisms for leveraging a state's own credit. I'm very involved in the public banking movement here in Massachusetts, which would enable the state of Massachusetts to use its own working capital to finance projects which it deems to be valuable to the Commonwealth. Conservatively, about $1 billion could be had literally within a matter of a few months if the state went ahead and created its own public bank. This would be without levying new taxes or anything else. If it sounds too good to be true, then I encourage you to actually learn something about this because it actually is true. I think it could go, those sorts of funds, especially in these rather tight times, could go a long way to kickstarting the sorts of changes that are being discussed here in this session tonight. So I just wanted to put forth a little plug, not so much a question, unfortunately, for people to start learning about this. And you can learn more about it at masspublicbanking.org. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you, Tim. Yeah, wholeheartedly agree.
So, Craig, I wanted to raise some real concerns that some of us have had now about the future of the climate movement. As we come out of the pandemic, if we ever do, is climate going to be on people's minds? Clearly, the executive branch is going to move us to a rapid increase in use of fossil fuels. We have various governments around the world making sure that the tropical rainforests are destroyed and turned into soybean or cattle raising or whatever. It just seems that there is a massive crisis going on right now in terms of slowing down the practical movement toward dealing with climate change. And how does the climate movement transition from the present situation into dealing with the fact that people are going to want to desperately get back to normal and not worry about things that may be a few years off, but dealing with the immediate future and just a lot of the other stuff going on right now as the pandemic is going on in terms of destruction of natural habitats and destruction of all the places that are going to absorb the carbon.
Yeah, it's a great question, Paul, and I think Gilda asked a similar one in the chat about how do we make sure that climate doesn't take a back seat. I think honestly, I think it was appropriate, and it is appropriate for us to take a back seat for a little while here. I think that this reckoning our country is having with racial justice is so long overdue. I know a lot of our 350 Mass members, including, I know that we've got a number here on the call, have turned out very intentionally for the Black Lives Matter movement over the past several weeks. And again, I think that that's really appropriate and strategic to do. And again, I think like the more we can show as a climate movement that we stand with our Black and brown brothers and sisters and gender nonconforming friends right now, that will help us have them be part of our coalition down the road when we turned to climate change. But I think in terms of people being worried about climate falling off the radar, unfortunately, I think the risk of that is actually pretty low. Because we've been dealing with COVID this spring, but as we head into the summer, as we head into the combination of COVID plus hurricanes, and as we head into the summer and fall of COVID plus wildfires, I think there's going to be a lot of attention paid to climate change. If people are told to shelter in place, and then there's a wildfire bearing down on their community, or there's a hurricane bearing down on their community, sheltering in place is going to get a heck of a lot harder. And unfortunately, again, we're going to see this intersection of structural racism, pandemic, and climate disasters come together. And I think that will help to elevate the people's consciousness and concerns around these climate impacts. At least here in the States, as for Brazil and other countries, I honestly have focused less on how we can move the needle there. I do think we have just such a historic obligation in this country to get our own ship in order and to lead here. And so that's really where I've been focusing my efforts. Certainly, again, what Brazil and other countries do with their land in particular is of critical importance. And I think I'm very pleased, or at least heartened to know that there are good people thinking about that and working on that. But yeah, again, I think the climate is going to make itself heard, and it's going to come back up. And I think the exciting thing is that as we're coming out of this pandemic again, there's going to be a desperate need for jobs and a desperate need for economic activity. And the good news is that we have a crisis that has a desperate need for jobs and a desperate need for economic activity in order to address that crisis. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to draw those connections and say, hey, yes, let's jumpstart our economy, but let's jumpstart it the right way by investing in the things that we all know will make our communities healthier, more sustainable, and more equitable.
Could you just mention a few parts of the Green New Deal that would actually do that in terms of jumpstarting the economy, putting people to work, and all that?
Yeah, so absolutely. I think pieces that I've heard. Well, first off, again, like a federal jobs guarantee, and within New England, there's a lot of talk about making that at the state level a jobs guarantee, where anyone who wants a job helping to address a climate crisis can have one. But we need to basically weatherize every single building in our state, in our country, and you can't take a building, ship it to China, and say, hey, make this more efficient for us, and shipping back. Like those are jobs that by their nature have to be here in the United States. Building out our public transit system, bringing high-speed rail to America, I think is going to be a really big jobs creator if we can make that investment. But it's also, thinking about investing in low carbon jobs. So things like universal pre-K. I think anyone who's had a child recently in this state or in this country knows how incredibly expensive childcare is. Right, and it's such a huge burden to ask people. We don't ask people to pay for education and for childcare from K through 12, but for those first 4 or 5 years, it's just parents, you're on your own. And if we make that investment, not only does that relieve a huge burden that we're placing on parents, particularly on those who can least afford to cover it. Again, with Black and brown parents among the most vulnerable economically to these requirements, but it also creates thousands and thousands of new jobs in terms of taking care of children. And similarly, investing in true universal health care, we have more nurses. I mean, the Mass Nurses Association was campaigning for having more nurses per hospital, which was unfortunately rejected at the ballot, last November, but I think is looking prescient right now. I think most people, if they took that vote now, would say, actually, yeah, maybe we do want more nurses in our system and in our society. So, John McDougall in the chat is saying, build the red line, blue line connection in Boston. South Coast Rail, getting rail out to Western Mass. Again, Michelle Wu's been doing great work in the city of Boston of having free public transit, or at the very least free buses, which again will have both that equity enhancing feature of relieving the economic burden of people who don't live by the T lines but rely on buses to get to work. There's just so many things that we could be investing in, that we should be investing in, that both reduce carbon pollution and make our society better and stronger.
And will those, there's going to be a Massachusetts Green New Deal revealed in January?
That's the current plan. Yes, is to have either one bill or a series of bills, a package of bills that we will say this is the Massachusetts Green New Deal that we can then all rally behind and really implore our legislators to pass with all due haste.
Great. Well, do you see, Craig, do you see any other questions there in chat that we haven't focused on at all? We just have a few more minutes.
Yeah, I think, well, there's one just taking the order. Is there a national Green New Deal from Howard? Is there a Massachusetts Green New Deal? So again, I think the short version is both of those are in formation. There's obviously the National Green New Deal resolution, but I think it's a 12-page non-binding resolution. And there are folks, there's a coalition at the national level working to flesh out what are the actual legislative components to a Green New Deal. And that work is, again, ongoing at the national level, and then that work is also ongoing at the state and regional levels for Massachusetts and New England. So the answer is not yet, but there will be. And again, here in Massachusetts, we're hoping to have legislation to file in January. I got another question about how do we support the Green New Deal? What should be done to improve race outcomes for COVID? What about improving services in communities of color? Again, I think how do we support the Green New Deal? I'd say the first step would be if you can support these ballot initiatives between now and July 1st, and then make sure once they're on the ballot to vote for them and get your friends to vote for them. I think that's a very immediate ask. I think longer term, again, supporting candidates that back the Green New Deal is critical in this election season. And then again, once the legislation is filed, rallying behind it. I'm gonna, I think, skip the how do we improve race outcomes for COVID, because I feel like that's gonna be a longer response, but happy to take that offline if you want to drop me an email. If there's anything else real quick. Yeah, all essential workers a wage that respects the value of their work from Paula. Absolutely. I think, again, improving people's pay is also a great way to bring about more economic activity. I know the paraprofessionals here in Somerville are making like $22,000 a year. These are educators, people are supposed to take care of our kids and somehow take care of their families off of that salary. That is utterly absurd. And money we put in their pockets is going to immediately go back into the economy to have a much better economic impact than having that money be concentrated in the hands of the wealthy. I think that, I feel like I may have missed a question, but
okay.
Yeah.
I think we covered quite a bit of ground. I want to thank you, Craig. I just want to let folks who have tuned in know that there are a number of really very interested webinars coming up that Mass Peace Action is going to be having. Tomorrow night there's a national webinar on Korea by Bruce Cummings, probably the foremost intellectual studying the Korea and the Korean War and the present crisis. That's going to be at 8 o'clock tomorrow night Eastern Time. Next Wednesday, we have a webinar, a Zoom meeting, I should say, with Danny Scherzen and Danny Luker, veterans of different wars, of different eras, talking about resistance in the military. This relates to the refusal, or I should say the disgruntlement in the military over Trump's threat to use the army to crush protests. And so that webinar will focus on that. This Sunday, there's a very important event if we're talking about the Green New Deal, since Ed Markey is the author of that in the Senate. We will be having a public meeting with Ed Markey and have a chance to ask him a bunch of questions. But the main event will be to try to show you how you can plug into the Markey campaign and make sure that he can get reelected. So that's this Sunday evening. All of these events will be on the Mass Peace Action website. I would like to invite everyone here to the next meeting of the Mass Peace Action Peace and Climate Working Group, which is on July 15th in the evening. We'll be sending you information about how you would plug into that meeting. Brian and Cole, do you have other things you would like to add before we close out tonight?
The only other one I'll add is the Authoritarianism or Democracy with Noam Chomsky, Van Goss, and Tida Pass, Monday, June 29th at 7 p.m.
So like I say, all these will be on the Peace Action website. And in addition, you'll be getting, everyone who registered for tonight will get a message with how to, of where a copy of this program can be found on the Massachusetts Peace Action YouTube page or on the one of the other social media locations. So there'll be more information coming at you. Craig has mentioned some things you can do. There's plenty of actions that are needed. If we can all do something, we'll kind of move this ball a little bit forward. And Craig, again, thank you so much. And let's stay in touch as this situation, this incredible situation we're in right now, unfolds.
Absolutely. Well, it's such a treat to be with you here, Paul, and you know, MAPA has been such a great partner over the years. So I'm delighted to have had the opportunity to speak with you all. Thank you.
Good night, Craig. Good night, everybody.
Good night, all.